It's been nearly 2 months now since the last election in Canadian history, and as someone who's made a video on all 45 of them, I thought it'd be a good idea to make a ranking of all 45 elections in Canadian history. So that's what I've done. I've ranked every single election since Confederation. And I want to know, do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? What's your ranking? Number 5, I've put the election of 1887. I feel that this election didn't really shake anything up. There wasn't a new prime minister or a ruling party or anything. It was just the status quo. It wasn't even that much of a seat shift either. It just resulted in the same thing as it was before. In fact, I don't think this election wouldn't have happened had it not been 5 years after the previous one. Sir John A. Macdonald's majority just stayed that way. Number 44. In this place, I've got 1882. This is because I believe that this election, much like its successor, just didn't change anything. Nothing really changed. It was the same thing as it was before. The only reason why I have this slightly above the election of 1887 is because there was a new Liberal leader. Edward Blake, who had previously been the unofficial leader in 1872, became the official leader for this election, but he was still the leader in the 1887 election, so I put this one slightly higher. 43. 1891. 1891 gets this reputation as a more important election that at least I think people think of it as a more important election than it really is. I think people think this because it's the last election that Sir John A. Macdonald was around for, and that's true. Sir John A. Macdonald was not around anymore after this election. He died a couple of weeks later, and I think it's also pretty cool because it was Sir John A. Macdonald going against Wilfrid Laurier, and they were prime ministers at much different times, much different eras in Canadian history. However, again, nothing really changed in this election. It was most of the same as it was before. In 42nd place, we have finally moved away from Sir John A. Macdonald's return, and we've moved nearly a century ahead to 1965. And what I don't find interesting here is that it's the same outcome. Lester B. Pearson called the selection for 1965 with the same conservative leader and really gained literally only 3 seats. This election didn't have much effect on Canadian history, as the next election was in 1968 in real life and would have been so anyways. So, I hope you like the vacation from Sir John A. Macdonald's second time in office, because we're going right back in 41st place, 1878. And this election actually, a lot of people might think that there's more substance to it, but there really isn't. An unpopular liberal leader being succeeded by a conservative leader is nothing new. Sure, it is, after all, a former prime minister as that conservative leader. Sure, I'll give you that. However, this election didn't result in much. Sure, the Liberals left and the Conservatives came back, but outside of the return of a Prime Minister who had already been such, nothing really of interest happened here. Number 40, 1908. We've left Sir John A. Macdonald, but we haven't ventured much further. We're on to Sir Wilfrid Laurier's third election as Prime Minister. Well, technically second as Prime Minister, but third election that he participated in, and he won. He won the 1908 election. And the Conservative leader, Sir Robert Borden, had been the Conservative leader in 1904. So, again, nothing happened in this election. I guess you can tell what my criteria is for an interesting election. Number 39, 1940. I've selected 1940 to be this low down because, sure, there was technically a new party with the National Government Party. However, that's really just the conservatives in the mask. It's the same thing. So I can't really say that that's a different party entirely and mark this higher up. Also, William Lyon Mackenzie King won a majority again. Like, it doesn't matter. Sure, this election did decide who was going to lead the country during World War II, and that's why I avoided putting it in the bottom couple and in the top 40. But overall, there's really nothing of substance in this election to look at. In number 38th place, I've gone for 1904. This election didn't have anything to talk about. There was no significant change at the end as it was in the beginning. Laurier's government actually won more seats. So it was kind of the opposite of interesting. However, I put it this high up because it's actually the end of a very important legacy in Canadian political history. It's the end of Sir Charles Tupper as a politician. And interestingly, the beginning of Sir Robert Borden's national fame, who is again another very important figure in Canadian history. Number 37, 1962. This election was the first in 4 years, and the third in this kind of 6 year stretch in Canadian history where there wasn't really any stability, and that was through the Diefenbaker prime ministership. But in 1962 was kind of like the go Diefenbaker kind of moment in a sense because um, this election had I mean Diefenbaker lost support in this election from the last election, but I don't know where I was going with this. Rounding off the bottom 10, in 36th place, it's 1872. Now, this election actually was pretty cool in a sense, but it wasn't important. Sure, Sir John A. Macdonald, uh, it was the first minority government in Canadian history. That's pretty important. However, his government was still propped up by conservatives. So it's very hard to really say this was the first minority. You guys got to care about this one. So I don't really think it's too important in that way. However, the Liberals were 6 seats away from unseating, well, technically only three, if you really think about it, from unseating Sir John A. Macdonald. However, they didn't have an official leader, so that would have gone nowhere. But it's interesting to think about what would have happened. 35, 1900. This election saw Wilfrid Laurier, yes, win more seats and continue on in government. However, it was the first time that he won the popular vote, having won the election but lost the popular vote in 1896. So I think that's what propelled it up a little bit higher. It was also the last time we saw Sir Charles Tupper as a major figure on the Canadian political scale. So that's pretty cool. But otherwise, nothing is sticks out other than that. Number 34, 1930. This is the first election which saw a transition of power to a completely new guy that wasn't previously prime minister. This was also the first election during the Great Depression. And the winner of this election, conservative R.B. Bennett, technically got us out of the Great Depression. So that's pretty cool. Number 33, 1963. This election saw the transition of power from John G. Diefenbaker and the Progressive Conservatives to Lester B. Pearson and the Liberals. Now, that is pretty important, especially considering how important Lester Pearson was as a prime minister. However, the Liberals had dominated before this. And I know that's not really an excuse to say this election should be around this spot. However, I do sincerely believe that the elections higher than this have more of a wow, this is a very cool election point of view. And then for 32, we're going 10 years prior, 1953. I've chosen 1953 because it actually shows the start of decline for support for Louis Saint Laurent's liberal government and shows cracks of a nearly 20-year kind of rule of the Liberal Party coming to an end. It shows the cracks. However, Louis Saint Laurent does still win a pretty big majority, so it's not higher up on the list. 31, 1945. This election decided a lot less than 1940 did, especially since William Lyon Mackenzie King still won. However, I think this is important because it's not technically, but could be seen as the start of the Progressive Conservative Party in Canada, which is very important. 30th, 1968. This was the first election with Pierre Elliott Trudeau as one of the leading candidates, and he would be a pretty important figure for the next, say, 16 years? So he's pretty important, and this election marks that as well. However, the Conservatives and the NDP didn't really matter as much in this election as they did in previous elections. I think this election was more so for the Social Credit Party, which split between the Social Credit Party in English Canada and the Réellement Crediste Party in everywhere else. So, Quebec. Number 29, 1949. I think this election is pretty interesting because it was the first one without William Lyon Mackenzie King as leader of the Liberal Party in 30 years. Louis Saint Laurent took the reins of the party and guided the party to their biggest ever majority in their history, winning 190 seats. Incredible majority. And it was also pretty interesting for the Progressive Conservatives because this was the first election with George Drew, who was pretty an influential person in Canadian history. 2028, 2021. I'll put the 2021 election down here because nothing happened. Literally, it signifies nothing. It was called in the middle of a pandemic, saw 6% less turnout, and only 5 seats went more to the Liberals than in the last election. It was not a very strong showing for any of the parties, really. This election was just plain pointless. Number 27, 1980. The 1980 election was called on a motion of no confidence on Joe Clark's government after the Social Credit Party, which had previously agreed to back them up, did not back them up. Trudeau ended up winning this election and served out for the next 4 years. However, this election, it's not interesting. If you want to learn about Canadian elections, I definitely do not recommend 1980. 26, 1979. This election happened just 1 year before 1980, and most of the same happened. The only real difference was that Joe Clark won the election and Trudeau had lost. So it's higher up because there's a new prime minister, but in all circumstances, it's a pretty uneventful election. 25, 1935. I believe that 1935 did show um, kind of some interesting results as the Liberals got a humongous amount of seats and the Conservatives being beat down to one of their worst defeats on par with 1993. That's how bad it was. But honestly, going back to another former prime minister when the economy's bad, I honestly don't think that it's a very election to look at with, wow, what a great election kind of view. 24, 2008. This was the third election in 4 years. So a lot of people were pretty tired of elections at this point, I would say. We have a new liberal leader. Stéphane Dion is the new liberal leader. So the election itself isn't very interesting to look at, but what came out of it is why I have it in this position, kind of halfway in. The result of this election was Stephen Harper getting a minority government, which makes Stéphane Dion go, hey, if I get help from the NDP in the bloc, I'll be the prime minister. So that's what he tries to do. The NDP is on board with it, and the bloc's on board with it for a little bit until they're not on board with it. The whole thing blows up as Dion resigns, and then Michael Ignatieff comes in, who is a very interesting character. 23, 1997. This election was much the same as just a continuation on from 1993. The Conservatives in last, NDP doesn't have a big amount of seats, Liberals with a huge majority. The only thing that swapped was Bloc Québécois and Reform, because the Bloc Québécois were the official opposition after the previous election. They lost seats, and they went down into third, while Reform were in third and now are the official opposition. So a bit of a change there. Number 22, 1974. This election kind of had to be held. You see, the last election, 1972, which we will get into in a while, okay, it's really high up the list. The Liberals won, in a summary, by 2 seats over the Progressive Conservatives. So this election kind of had to happen to settle the deadlock that was happening in the parliament. And so we resulted in this. The Conservatives actually probably would have done better, but this election saw the birth of the Robert Stanfield with a football picture. 21, 2019. I think the 2019 election, I might have put it a bit higher than it deserves because this was the first election that I actually remember. And I remember making a bet with my teacher at the time. She said, "Hey, if the Bloc Québécois wins this election, I'll buy you McDonald's for lunch." So I was kind of secretly hoping for the Bloc Québécois to win. Now, in hindsight, knowing that they physically can't win, it's kind of a rude thing to do. You're getting my hopes up for nothing. But, anyways, it really didn't have much of effect. Justin Trudeau went down in seats to a minority, and the Conservatives won the popular vote. So if that's something that tickles your fancy, there you go. 20, 2000. The 2000 election was more of Jean Chrétien's gamble than anything else, really. Jean Chrétien gambled on, hey, I think I could win this. And you know what? Props to him, because he definitely won the 2000 election. This was the first time that the Reform Party had changed their name to the Alliance Party, and they were competing under the Alliance Party, and was also the last time that the Progressive Conservatives competed in an election. So if you want to start with this one, I think it's pretty interesting. 19, 1988. I think the 1988 election gets a lot more hype than it really does because, ooh, Brian Mulroney, he won a massive majority. But you know what? He did the same thing 4 years ago, and he did it much more spectacularly in 1984 than in 1988. However, just the nature of how big his majority was, even still in 1988, and just to see how unpopular he was 5 years later to the point where they got 2 seats is really fascinating. And for me, it's top 20 worthy. 18, 2015. The 2015 election saw a huge majority for the Liberals. They were very close to beating their own record set by Louis Saint Laurent in 1949, but they fell just short, about 7 or so seats short of unseating their own record. However, I do believe that this election is still pretty monumental. It shows just how popular Justin Trudeau was at the start of him being the Liberal leader and the Prime Minister, of course. In 2016, it was shown that he had a really high approval rating. However, of course, as we know now, he's not so popular anymore. I think this is also very important as it was the only time the Liberals won the popular vote in the 21-year span of 2004 to 2025. 17, 2006. On the surface, this shouldn't be important at all. It was smack dab in the middle of 3 elections in 4 years. Why should anyone care about the second one? I think people should care about the second one because it showed the first time the conservatives got into power since their merger in 2003. It also marked a 13 year time period of the liberals in office, and it's gone now. It's pretty long time, and yeah, no more. So I think it's a very interesting election. 16, 2004. This was the first of 3 elections in 4 years. Now, it's the third time I've said that. But 2004 is actually a pretty cool election because it saw Paul Martin get elected in his own right, and it was the first time that the Conservatives competed since their merger in 2003. Yeah, that's all I have to say. It's a pretty cool election. 15, 2025. Sure, I acknowledge that I could be biased here with the recency bias. However, I'm very, very certain that this election that happened this year will be somewhere around here in the next 100 years, because 2025 is a very important election, or I guess I say was a very important election, because it marked a lot of important stuff, right, with the tariffs and Donald Trump and a lot of stuff, right? So it's a very, very important election, and I do think that people will remember it as such. 14, 1957. This election marked a crazy time in Canadian history. A staggering 22 years of straight Liberal Party rule over Canada came to an end as the Conservatives under John Diefenbaker finally beat Louis Saint Laurent. However, Louis Saint Laurent actually won the popular vote, and a lot of people were urging him to sign a deal with the NDP for him to remain as the Prime Minister. However, he said, "No, I'm too tired. I don't want to do this anymore, man." 13, 1958. The largest majority in Canadian history, 208 seats, which technically isn't the most amount of seats that anyone's got, but it is the most by percentage. John Diefenbaker crushed Lester Pearson with this one. And while that is very interesting, I can't really point to anything else. Sure, the obliteration of the Social Credit Party, they went down to 0 seats. However, I mean, what else than that? So, while it is a very important election, I just don't think it was too interesting. 12th, 1984. The 1984 election demonstrated a massive shift. It was the first conservative majority since R.B. Bennett. It was intense. Brian Mulroney was insanely popular at this time. It was also the most amount of seats that anyone has ever gotten in an election, with 211. Not to mention that incredible debate spar off between him and John Turner.
And people a deep apology for having indulged in that kind of practice with those kinds of appointments.
Well, I've told you and told the Canadian people, Mr. Mulroney, that I had no option.
Well,
Truman, your next question,
you
please.
had an option, sir. You could have said, I am not going to do it. This is wrong for Canada, and I am not going to ask Canadians to pay the price. You had an option, sir, to say no, and you chose to say yes to the old attitudes and the old stories of the Liberal Party. That, sir, if I may say respectfully, that is not good enough for Canadians.
I had no option if I was able
That
to
is an
form a
avowal
government.
of failure. That is a confession of non-leadership, and this country needs leadership. You had an option, sir. You could have done better.
11, 1911. The 1911 election marked a massive shift in not only Canadian politics but Canada-US relations. How on earth does 1911 election in Canada result in any kind of effect for the US? Well, in the US, President William Howard Taft actually wanted Laurier to do a free trade agreement with him, but Laurier couldn't get the support of the House. So he called an election, say, hey, you know what? Free trade issue. And Borden of the Conservative Party absolutely crushed Laurier. Laurier couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't do the free trade agreement, and Taft was sad. And Borden, he kind of cut off the whole free trade agreement, and we had to wait until 1980 something with Brian Mulroney in office for NAFTA. In the top 10, number 10 spot is 1867. Now you may think, oh, you're just overhyping this election because it was the first one. And first of all, that is a great reason to look at an election and say this is important. It's the first one. The first one to do anything is important. But also, there was a third party in this election. The Anti-Confederation Party ran strictly in Nova Scotia and won almost all of the seats there. So it is a pretty important election. In ninth, 1993. Now you might again be like, whoa, you're just overhyping this one because the Conservatives got only 2 seats. And you know what? That's a pretty big thing. I mean, the Conservative Party had been influential since Confederation, and now they have 2 seats. So it's a very important thing. But also, the Reform Party splitting from the Conservatives, that's big. That's a big deal. And the Bloc Québécois, Quebec separatism was a huge deal in this election, a very important topic. Number 8, 1921. Not only did the 1921 election completely end the reign of conservatives, which again, I guess hadn't been too long, only 10 years, but it started William Lyon Mackenzie King's longest premiership in Canadian history of 22 years. Not only that, it was the start of significant third parties. The Progressive Party rose up in this election and got second. 7. 1874. Now you may be like, what? How is this election so high up? But this is the election that people were revealed Sir John A. Macdonald's scandals of the Pacific Railway scandal when he was in office in the 1872 election. Also, Sir John A. Macdonald lost. That's a big thing. And the Liberals took over with their first ever official leader, Alexander Mackenzie. So it's a pretty big deal. Number 6, 1926. This election represents how Canadians feel after scandals. William Lyon Mackenzie King had the King Byng affair after the previous election, which we haven't talked about yet, so we're going to talk about it soon. Um, and they voted in droves for Arthur Meehan, but Mackenzie King won the election on the seats. So, I mean, this election and the last election, I feel like are all part of the same kind of story. You can't really talk about the 1926 election without talking about the 1925 election, and the reverse is true. With that being said, number 5 is the 1925 election, and that's not really that surprising. In the 1925 election, Arthur Meehan, the previous prime minister, had unseated and beat William Lyon Mackenzie King's Liberals. Um, but Meehan didn't win a majority. But do you know who would have? The Liberals and the Progressives working together. So that's what they did. The Liberals and the Progressives worked together in a kind of coalition, and the Progressives supported the Liberals until the Progressives didn't support the Liberals, and the Liberals were kind of scared. So they called William Lyon Mackenzie King didn't call an election, more so that he resigned, and then Arthur Meehan came in as prime minister in 1926 and lost a no confidence vote, and that forced the next election in 1926. But either way, it's a crazy story that I can barely fit into just this video. Number 4, 1972. There's 3 elections that I say have are the most important in Canadian history, and 1972 is one of them. Interestingly, it's not in the top 3, but that's just how it works. The 1972 election was just insane. You see, Pierre Elliott Trudeau had won in 1968 in a majority, the first majority since Diefenbaker, so it was a pretty big deal. By the 1972 election, there's a new conservative leader. Well, not a new conservative leader, but um, a newer conservative leader is Robert Stanfield. He was around in 1968, but he's still around in 1972. And the results is what I'm interested in. It's the Trudeau's government and the Liberals winning by 2 seats over the Conservatives. An absolute incredible election. It's very insane how this one panned out. Number 3, 2011. I think everyone saw this coming. I mean, who wouldn't put the 2011 election in their top 10 most important? For anyone who doesn't know about the 2011 election, um, a lot of stuff happened. There was It was crazy how it started because the Liberals, NDP, and Bloc all agreed to a vote of no confidence against the Conservatives, which passed, but the Conservatives won the election in a majority. Second place wasn't the Liberals, as it had been since literally Confederation. It was the NDP, who soared up to 103 seats. The Liberals came down into third with 34 seats, the lowest amount of seats they've ever had, and they're in third place. They've never been in third place before. As for the Bloc, they went from 51 seats to 4. Absolutely insane results. Number 2, 1917. The 1917 election. Wow. What a crazy time. There was technically no liberals nor conservatives. The people who would consider themselves liberals were led by Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and he led kind of sort of the Laurier liberals. And the other party was the Unionists, led by incumbent Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden. He was, the Unionists were either the conservatives or the other unloyal-ish or disloyal, I guess is the word, for on the liberal side, they joined the Unionists. So a very interesting prospect. It was created just for the First World War. Didn't last much longer, but an incredible spectacle the 1917 election was. And finally, number one, the election of 1896. Now, you may think that this is undeserving of number one. However, I completely disagree with you. The 1896 election was the first that the Liberals won in how many years would that be? Over almost 20 years. Over 20 years. That is insane. And also, the Conservatives, they were in power for so long. There was a tiny little gap, 4 years with Alexander Mackenzie. But honestly, it was really just the Conservatives. And they absolutely dominated the 19th century in Canadian politics. But 1896 was a swap. Laurier finally steps in, and the Liberals break through. They're in power now. It was also the first time in Canadian history that the winner of the popular vote did not match with the winner of the most amount of seats. The 1896 election will probably go down for me as the best election in Canadian history for a while. And there you go. That's every single election in Canadian history ranked. What do you think? Do you think I'm right? Do you think I'm wrong? What do you think I missed? I sure did skip over a lot. I mean, how on earth did I not mention the Manitoba schools question once? But, anyways, very important elections in this video. I think this is going to be a pretty cool video. What do you guys think?